In the beginning, long before the stars themselves had burned bright enough to nurture life, there was silence, a silence so profound that it seemed eternal, a canvas upon which only possibility stretched. Across that endless void, the seeds of the future Imperium of Man had not yet been sown, and even the most ancient entities of the galaxy still slumbered in their chrysalis-like beginnings. It is here, in this primordial stillness, that the tale of the forgotten Primarchs first whispers its presence. The Primarchs, those mighty sons of the Emperor of Mankind, were conceived as the very embodiment of human perfection. Yet 2 of them were struck from the record, their existence scrubbed so thoroughly that only fragments of rumor remain. To understand their absence, one must first drift back across the current of time, back to the dawn before the Emperor's grand design, and trace the movement of powers older than the Imperium, older even than mankind's first spark of civilization. Imagine the galaxy not as it is now, fractured by war and ruled by shadows of faith and tyranny, but as a cauldron of forces. The warp churned like a restless ocean, its tides influencing the material realm. The first stirrings of sentient within that Empyrean dimension were already taking shape, giving rise to entities that would one day be known as gods. Beside them, countless stars were being born and extinguished in endless cycles, their brief lifespans no more significant than flickering embers compared to the eternal weight of the void. It was within this expanse, cold and unfeeling, that the stage of the Primarch's eventual fate was laid. The Emperor himself, an immortal born of ancient Terran ritual and sacrifice, carried within his veins the hopes of countless generations. But before he would stride forth to unify humanity beneath the banner of the Imperium, he lingered in anonymity, walking among mortals in secret. Through centuries beyond counting, he guided and influenced, always waiting for the time when mankind would be ready. The great project of the Primarchs, however, required more than patience. It demanded an act of creation that skirted the very edges of forbidden power. For in fashioning the Primarchs, the Emperor wrestled with truths that humanity was never meant to touch. He bent the tides of the warp to his purpose, weaving together strands of flesh, soul, and psychic resonance. 20 suns emerged, titanic in potential, each infused with fragments of his own essence. Yet the warp is a realm of capricious hunger, and when the Primarchs were cast into the material world, the currents scattered them like seeds upon a storm. Each was flung across the galaxy to distant worlds, destined to rise among alien stars before the Emperor could reclaim them. It is here, in this scattering, that mystery coils around the tale. For while 18 Primarchs were eventually found, revered, and written into the annals of the Imperium, 2 were not simply lost. They were erased. Their names, their deeds, even their homeworlds, obliterated with deliberate thoroughness that speaks of shame, fear, or both. The forgotten Primarchs are remembered only as echoes, statues broken, records sealed, whispers exchanged in hidden corners by those too reckless to ignore the silence. But before we can probe that silence, we must understand the galaxy into which they were born. This was no tranquil cradle. It was a time of ancient powers lingering in decline. The Necrons entombed within their starless tomb worlds, the Eldar lords steeped in decadence before their tragic fall, and the ever-present warp seething with malign intelligence. Each of these forces, in ways both subtle and catastrophic, pressed upon the Emperor's design. It was inevitable that the Forgotten Sons would be shaped by this grand interplay, just as surely as they were shaped by his hand. Let us pause here, in this vision of primordial times. Imagine the hum of galactic currents, the slow breathing of the cosmos itself, vast and indifferent. In the span of such immensity, human lifetimes are little more than moments, yet even these fleeting sparks burn brightly enough to carve eternity. Against this backdrop, the tale of the forgotten Primarchs begins, not in triumph, but in shadows that stretch across millennia. And so, as the galaxy turned, the Emperor prepared his secret work. The seeds of greatness lay dormant, waiting to emerge. But already, the warp stirred in defiance, and already, the weight of destiny pressed down upon those who would never be remembered. The Emperor of Mankind walked the earth for millennia in secrecy, a figure myth cloaked in the anonymity of mortal flesh. He bore countless names across ages and cultures, appearing as a shaman, a prophet, a king, or a scholar. Always, he nudged humanity toward unity, subtly correcting its course through the storms of history. Yet all these acts, however grand, were but preludes to the single most ambitious work of creation he would ever undertake. That work was the Primarch Project, conceived in the dim laboratories of terror beneath the veil of the Unification Wars. It was nothing less than an attempt to shape the perfect generals, statesmen, and demigods who would march at the head of his armies. The Emperor's genius surpassed comprehension, but even he was forced to draw upon the warp to weave such beings. He did not merely build warriors. He birthed scions, reflections of his own essence, endowed with powers both physical and psychic, beyond anything humanity had ever known. Each of the 20 Primarchs was unique, embodying a fragment of the Emperor's vast nature. Some bore the weight of wisdom, others the fury of war, others the cold logic of strategy, or the warmth of inspiration. They were more than sons. They were a mirror broken into 20 shards, each reflecting a different glimmer of his divinity. Yet it is here that the shadow falls. Among those 20, 2 were doomed to absence. Their statues would stand silent in the great hall of the Primarchs, their names scratched from every record, their deeds erased as though they had never drawn breath. This act of deliberate omission is no accident of history. It is a wound in the narrative of the Imperium, one that festers with speculation and forbidden whispers. Who were these lost sons? What flaw, what sin, what cataclysm caused even the Emperor to hide them from his children? In the Imperium as it exists today, such questions are dangerous. To even speak of the forgotten Primarchs invites the ire of the Inquisition. Yet despite their erasure, fragments endure. A broken carving, a silenced archive, an uneasy pause in the words of those who knew more than they dared to say. The very act of concealment sharpens curiosity, for it is human nature to seek what is denied. The silence becomes a presence of its own, and in that presence, the forgotten Primarchs loom as vast as those whose names endure in glory or infamy. If the Emperor saw perfection in his sons, then perhaps these 2 represented imperfection too great to abide. Perhaps they fell, not with the grandeur of Horus's rebellion, but with something quieter, something more shameful, an aberration of design, a failure that could not be permitted to live on in memory. Or perhaps they defied him in ways that cut deeper than treachery, striking at principles so sacred that to acknowledge them would unravel the myth of his perfection. Others whisper that their absence was not due to failure, but to sacrifice, that these lost Primarchs were the first and greatest victims of the Emperor's ambition, destroyed not for weakness but for strength too dangerous to endure. Some claim they glimpsed truths the Emperor sought to conceal, truths about the warp, about his own nature, about the destiny of mankind. And so their memory was sealed, their very existence scrubbed clean, leaving only 2 empty plinths as eternal reminders of silence. The truth remains buried, but the mystery itself becomes part of their legacy. In a galaxy where knowledge is power, the absence of knowledge is often more dangerous still. When the Emperor's great work was complete, 20 gestation pods lay before him, each one a vessel for a son who would embody a shard of his vision. The Primarchs, as they would one day be known, were the keystones of his ambition, to forge a galaxy-spanning empire where mankind would reign supreme, free from superstition and guided by reason under his immortal hand. Yet the moment of triumph was brief, for the warp is a jealous realm. Whether it was a machination of dark gods or some unforeseen weakness in the wards shielding his work, none can say with certainty, but what followed was catastrophic. A great storm erupted within the Immaterium, and the Primarchs were torn from their father before they had even opened their eyes. One by one, their cradles were cast adrift, ripped from Terra and hurled across light years, scattering them to strange world where fate and chance would shape them until the Emperor's crusade could bring them home. The scattering has been recounted countless times, and each tale emphasizes the cruelty of it. The sons denied their father. The father denied his sons. The Imperium denied the unity of its perfect beginning. Yet within this tragedy lies the greater silence of the forgotten too. For while 18 Primarchs can be traced, found upon distant worlds, raised among alien cultures, and eventually rediscovered by the Emperor, 2 leave behind no such trail. Their cradles are lost not only to time, but to memory itself. It is as though, when the warp cast its storm, it claimed them more completely than the rest, enfolding them into an oblivion that not even the Emperor dared contest. Some whisper that their cradles never found purchase upon alien soil, but instead were swallowed whole, condemned to drift endlessly through the warp, their cargo unburdened, their promise unfulfilled. Others suggest more sinister fates, that the dark gods of chaos, sensing the potency of these unborn demigods, seize them for their own, twisting them into servants of their nightmare dominions. Still others claim the Emperor himself, perceiving flaws or dangers in their very conception, chose to unmake them once he finally reclaimed his surviving sons. What fragments of lore survive hint at strange anomalies. Records of the Great Crusade describe gaps in chronology, campaigns hinted at but never fully explained, as though entire conquests were erased from the archives. Certain accounts of the legions mention the existence of formations that later vanished, their banners burned, their battle records struck clean. Even in the monuments of the Imperium, the mystery lingers. The Grand Hall of the Primarchs upon Terra holds 20 plinths, yet 2 stand in deliberate silence. Empty spaces framed by grandeur, reminders that something once stood there, but no longer does. The most striking detail is that these silences are not accidents. They are purposeful. The Imperium does not shy away from recounting Horus's treachery, nor from dwelling upon the bloody tragedies of the heresy. It does not erase Lorgar's blasphemies, Angren's fury, or Fulgrim's corruption. Yet these 2 sons are absent in ways that speak of intent. Statues shattered, records deleted, oaths sworn never to speak their names. If Horus's betrayal was a wound of open rebellion, then the forgotten Primarchs are scars carved by deliberate amputation. And what, then, can be inferred from such a choice? Perhaps the Emperor himself ordered the erasure, in a rare admission of his own failure. Perhaps it was Guilliman, in his attempt to preserve order during the Imperium's darkest hours, who sanctioned the silence. Or perhaps it was the work of the Inquisition, fearful that the truth of these sons would unravel the faith of the masses. Whatever the case, the effect is the same. The silence is heavier than words, and the void where history should be becomes its own form of lore. The warp, ever restless, seemed to echo this void. In the visions of sanctioned psychers and the ramblings of the mad, shadows of forgotten figures sometimes appear, warriors whose names are forbidden, standing among the ranks of the Primarchs in dreams. They are half-formed, indistinct, like silhouettes against a storm. To speak of them is to invite censure, yet their presence endures in the subconscious of mankind, a reminder that absence is never truly empty. Consider the enormity of what is being withheld. The Primarchs were not mere generals. They were the pillars of the Emperor's vision. To erase 2 of them is to erase entire threads of destiny, wars fought, worlds conquered, choices made that might have changed the fate of the galaxy. Their erasure is not just about names. It is about possibilities denied. What manner of beings were they, that their existence could not be reconciled with the Imperium's truth? In the dim quiet of forgotten archives, one might imagine these lost sons lingering like ghosts, not alive, not dead, but entombed in secrecy. Their voices silenced, their legacies unspoken, yet their absence shaping everything around them. For the galaxy we know is not only the sum of what occurred, it is also the sum of what was erased. The Imperium that rose, the heresy that shattered it, the millennia of decay that followed, all unfolded in a galaxy missing 2 of its keystones. Here, then, lies the heart of the mystery, whether the forgotten Primarchs were erased because of weakness, corruption, defiance, or some unimaginable truth that the Imperium could never bear. Each possibility carries its own weight, its own dread. In the shadows between these possibilities, we sense the presence of those sons, hidden yet eternal. And so, as the galaxy turns and the centuries bleed together, the forgotten Primarchs linger not in memory, but in silence. And silence, in its way, is louder than any story told. The Emperor stood upon Terra in ages long before the Imperium, unseen, unnamed, and yet ever present. He had wandered the world as a shadow, guiding tribes, kingdoms, and fledgling empires toward survival. But this endless drifting, this life of anonymity, was reaching its inevitable limit. For centuries, he had avoided the spotlight, content to whisper truths into the ears of kings and inventors, nudging humanity forward in increments. Yet with each passing age, he watched with growing dismay as those he had uplifted turned their knowledge into weapons of conquest and slaughter. What was meant to raise mankind toward harmony only accelerated their capacity for self-destruction. The climax of this hidden life arrived during humanity's age of strife. Warp storms ravaged the skies, cutting worlds off of one another, and psychers, untamed, uncontrolled, brought demonic horrors screaming into reality. Civilizations collapsed overnight, and Terra itself descended into a mire of techno-barbarism. Once great cities lay in ruin, ruled by warlords with scavenged weapons. Kings of Ash reigning over rubble. The Emperor watched silently, his golden form cloaked and unnoticed, moving among the broken remnants of humanity. But in the screams of the dying and the thunder of artillery, a decision crystallized within him. If he remained a hidden hand, humanity would vanish into extinction. The dream of mankind's ascension, nurtured across millennia, would collapse into nothingness. And so, the Emperor revealed himself. For the first time in history, he abandoned subtlety. His armies, forged from gene-forged warriors and advanced sciences hidden away for centuries, descended upon Terra like an unstoppable tide. The warlords who styled themselves as kings and prophets fell one by one before his golden standard. This was no mere campaign of conquest. It was an unveiling. For humanity to be saved, they had to see him, to know him, to follow him. His psychic presence radiated across the battlefield, breaking the will of tyrants, rallying broken men and women who had long since abandoned hope. It was here that the myth of the Emperor transformed into a living truth, not just a wanderer, not just a shadow, but a being who stood at the very center of destiny. And yet, even in triumph, his heart remained burdened. Every warlord slain, every fortress burned, every ancient relic destroyed in the fires of unification. It all weighed heavily upon him. For though he conquered in the name of peace, he knew peace had been bought with blood. He had ended chaos on Terra, but the galaxy beyond remained consumed by fire and darkness. This moment, the revelation of the Emperor to mankind, was both a triumph and a tragedy. Triumph, because mankind had found its savior. Tragedy, because that savior knew the path ahead would demand sacrifices beyond imagination. For the unified Terra was the first step in a war that would span stars, centuries, and souls. It was the end of his hidden era, the quiet wanderer gone forever. In his place now stood the Emperor of mankind, a ruler, a warlord, and a god in all but name. The great climax of his long concealment was not merely a choice to lead. It was the acceptance of a burden that would consume him for all eternity. With Terra united under his banner, the Emperor no longer had the luxury of anonymity. The golden figure who had once whispered from the shadows now stood at the forefront of history, and with visibility came inevitability, worship, obedience, and resistance alike. For those who had long prayed to false gods, the Emperor's radiance became proof of divinity. For those who had ruled through fear, his armies became executioners. And for humanity itself, broken, scattered, and desperate, he became the last hope for survival. Yet in the stillness of victory, the Emperor knew the true battle had only just begun. Terra's unification was not an end but a foundation. Beyond the poisoned skies of Earth, countless worlds lay in ruin, consumed by warp storms and alien predators. Humanity was scattered, fragmented, and vulnerable. The climax of Revelation gave way to a sobering truth. The galaxy would not welcome mankind's return. Every star beyond Terra promised both opportunity and bloodshed. And so, the Emperor began to build not just armies, but an imperium. Not just warriors, but legends. From the ashes of Terra's past, he would forge a dream of mankind's future. A dream that demanded loyalty, demanded sacrifice, and demanded a faith that might one day eclipse reason itself. Thus ended the Age of Shadows. Thus began the Imperium. The unification of Terra was not an ending, but a beginning. The endless wars that had scarred the surface of the cradle world were over. Yet beyond the atmosphere of the planet, a darker truth lingered. The galaxy itself was broken, fractured by old night, and haunted by powers that no throne on Earth could command. The Emperor stood upon a world at peace, but peace was fragile, and its borders ended where the void began. The storms of the warp still raged across the stars, cutting off worlds from one another, isolating humanity into pockets of savagery and silence. On some planets, long-forgotten colonies of mankind had regressed to primitive tribalism. On others, strange tyrannies ruled, with technology twisted into instruments of cruelty. And always, beyond the veil of reality, something stirred, entities that watched and waited and hungered for the chance to devour all that the Emperor sought to protect. It was in this silence between triumph and dread that he began to think not merely of Terra, but of forever. For the Emperor, the conquest of one planet could never be enough. His vision was infinite, reaching across time as much as space. He had forged peace from blood on Earth, but beyond the sky lay billions of stars and uncountable dangers. To face them, he would need more than armies. He would need generals beyond compare. He would need champions who were not just men, but something greater. The Emperor's vision had always reached further than the eyes of mortal men could see. To most of Terra's warlords, victory meant dominion over land, or control of armies, or the hoarding of relics from the dark age of technology. To him, these ambitions were as fleeting as the rise and fall of sand dunes in a desert. He was not concerned with decades or centuries, but with the survival of mankind in epochs beyond imagining. For even as he stood triumphant, the Emperor understood a truth that few could grasp. Humanity was not alone in the galaxy. There were predators older than the first civilizations of man, and hungers deeper than the void itself. The alien lurked in every corner of the stars, and beyond the material plane, the warp seethed with malice. Without order, humanity would be consumed, scattered, and forgotten. Another failed experiment in the endless churn of cosmic history. The Emperor sought to guard against that fate, to construct a bulwark so vast and unyielding that neither alien blade nor demonic fire could pierce it. Yet, for all his power, he knew he could not act alone. His gifts were mighty, but not limitless. Even he, a being who walked uncounted lifetimes, could not lead every battle, govern every world, and shield every frontier. To extend his will across the stars, he needed hands that were his own and voices that could speak with his authority. Thus, he dreamed of creating not merely soldiers, but paragons, beings who would embody aspects of his own genius, his own will, his own unyielding resolve. They would be commanders, philosophers, conquerors, and rulers, each uniquely shaped to govern humanity's destiny in the theater of the stars. They would not only lead armies, they would inspire civilizations. They would be his sons, born not of chance but of deliberate design, each a fragment of his own divinity clothed in flesh. This was the seed of the Primarch project, a vision that fused science older than history with psychic mastery beyond comprehension. In his mind, he began to sketch the outlines of perfection. Towering warriors with the strength of 10 men, the minds of strategists, and the charisma of kings. Each would carry something in him, yet each would be distinct, capable of thriving in different environments, different wars, and different ages. It was a dream that promised immortality, not for himself, but for mankind. For the Primarch succeeded, humanity would never again fall to darkness. The long night of anarchy and isolation would end, and in its place would rise an imperium that spanned the stars. And yet, even in the stillness of that dream, shadows stirred. For to reach such heights would mean drawing the gaze of powers that dwelt in silence, watching and waiting beyond the veil. The dream of the Primarchs could not remain his vision alone. For all his vastness of thought, the Emperor was no idle dreamer. He was a craftsman of realities, bending matter, spirit, and time to his will. Upon the secure foundations of Terra, He turned his focus inward, into laboratories buried deep beneath mountains, hidden from mortal eyes and shielded from the turbulence of the warp. There, in sanctums that echoed with silence and starlight, the seeds of divinity were planted. The methods he employed were older than terror itself, a synthesis of half-forgotten technologies from the Dark Age, combined with secrets gathered across lifetimes of wandering in shadows unseen by history. Gene forges hummed in vaults where the laws of nature were stretched but never broken, and psychic wards carved from the Emperor's own will guarded the fragile experiments within. Here, flesh was sculpted as though it were clay, and essence was bound as though it were light captured in crystal. The Primarchs were not conceived as mere warriors. They were meant to be archetypes, each carrying a portion of the Emperor's vast and multifaceted soul. Some would embody wisdom, others raw strength, others the gift of leadership or the capacity for cold, unflinching judgment. Each child was designed with deliberate intent, a reflection of the many roles humanity would require to master the galaxy. No single being, not even the Emperor, could perfectly balance every trait. But 20? 20 could serve as the pillars of an age. As the work advanced, the process revealed both its majesty and its danger. The chambers where the gestating Primarchs rested became suffused with psychic resonance. Even in their embryonic states, they radiated a kind of presence, subtle but undeniable, like the faint pressure of storm building before thunder splits the sky. Those few mortals permitted to witness the project whispered that to stand near these chambers was to feel awe bordering on terror. They were children unborn, yet they were already giants, already kings. The Emperor, for all his aloofness, allowed himself something perilously close to sentiment. In these creations, he did not see only instruments of war. He saw the possibility of companionship. Sons forged his image, heirs to his vision, perhaps even confidants in the lonely burden of his eternal purpose. It was a dangerous tenderness, for attachment was a flaw he rarely permitted himself. And yet, it is said that as he walked among their chambers, he sometimes spoke to them as though they could hear, murmuring words only a father would give to children not yet born. But in this act of creation, there was also hubris. To take the raw stuff of humanity and elevate it to such heights was to draw perilously close to the domain of gods. The Emperor knew this, but he dismissed the danger. He was older than gods, older than myths, and in his certainty, he pressed forward, blind to the ways in which his labors might echo beyond his control. For in the warp, the project could not go unnoticed. The beings that lurked within its tides felt the stirrings of power unlike any seen before. Each Primarch's essence shone like a beacon in the immaterium, and such predators, beacons are invitations. Even as the seeds of divinity were nurtured, shadows stretched long around them, and the first hints of tragedy coiled unseen in the depths of the warp. The chambers of creation stood in silence, vast cathedrals of glass, steel, and psychic wards woven like threads of gold. Within them rested the 20 gestation pods, each containing a being unlike any other in history. Their forms, though still unfinished, pulsed with life. Great silhouettes curled in suspended slumber, their bodies glowing faintly in the amniotic fluids that sustained them. They were no longer dreams. They were real, alive, and growing stronger with every passing hour. The Emperor moved among them as a sculptor might walk among his statues. Yet these were not stone. They were destiny. Each pod resonated with a different frequency, subtle but distinct, the embryonic essence of a soul taking shape. In one chamber, the atmosphere pressed heavy with the promise of strength, an aura of raw, indomitable will. In another, the presence was sharper, keener, filled with a strategic brilliance that seemed already awake, already watching. Others radiated warmth, charisma, the ability to draw hearts as much as armies. And still others carried a sense of cold, implacable judgment, as though justice itself were coiled within them, waiting to be born. As he beheld them, the Emperor allowed himself a rare moment of pride. He had reached further than any mortal or immortal before him. Not since the dark age of technology had such mastery been woven, and never before with such clarity of purpose. These were not accidents of evolution, nor the flawed remnants of forgotten science. They were deliberate, they were precise, they were his. But pride gave way to stillness as he felt the first tremors in the warp. At first it was faint, like ripples upon a vast ocean. Yet soon, those ripples deepened, growing into waves of malignant curiosity. The entities of the immaterium, ancient, hateful, and eternal, had taken notice. For the Primarchs were not only beings of flesh. They were fonts of psychic resonance, each a star flaring in the sea of the warp. And in that sea, stars drew predators. Shadows gathered. Whispers coiled. The foul intelligences of chaos pressed closer, not yet able to breach the Emperor's defenses, but testing, watching, waiting. To them, the Primarchs were not sons. They were prizes, weapons that could be turned, champions that could be corrupted. In their laughter, silent yet deafening across the veil, the seeds of future tragedy were sown. Still, the Emperor pressed forward, his will as iron. He walked among the chambers, his presence reinforcing the wards, his mind shielding the nascent giants from the touch of chaos. Yet even he knew, creation is never without cost. What he had forged here would reshape the galaxy, but it would also draw storms. And so it was at the birth of the Primarchs, for all its triumph, carried with the weight of dread. For in the echoing stillness of those hidden vaults, one could feel both majesty and doom. 20 beings slumbered, waiting to awaken. They would be heroes. They would be conquerors. They would be beloved sons. And in the end, they would be the cause of his greatest sorrow. When at last the chambers fell quiet again, the Emperor stood alone among the slumbering titans. The light of their gestation pods pulsed faintly, steady as a heartbeat, each a beacon of promise and peril. They were his triumph, his children, his generals, his instruments of destiny. Yet already he could feel the fabric of reality tightening around them, as though the galaxy itself had grown aware of their existence. On Terra, peace had been won. Armies marched in the Emperor's name. The storms of civil war had been quelled, and the old tyrants of Earth lay broken. But beyond Terra, the consequences of his work stretched outward like ripples on a dark sea. The warp had seen, and once seen, it could never unsee. The Primarchs, though unborn, had become the focus of powers that despised creation, order, and hope. The Emperor knew what was coming. His wards were strong, his will unbending, but the beings of the Immaterium were cunning beyond measure. They would strike not openly, but subtly, patiently, waiting for the moment when his defenses wavered, when his attention turned elsewhere. That moment would come as surely as night follows day. For now, the Primarchs remained safe, resting in the silence of hidden vaults. But their fate had already been sealed by the notice of chaos. The seeds had been planted. Soon, they would scatter, cast to the stars by forces older than mankind's memory. The fires of Terra had dimmed at last. The banners of warlords had fallen, their armies scattered, their fortresses reduced to ruins. For the first time in uncounted centuries, the cradle of mankind knew unity, and under the Emperor's watchful gaze, Earth was no longer a battlefield, but a foundation of something greater. Yet the Emperor's thoughts did not rest upon the soil of Terra alone. His gaze stretched outward, past a thin veil of atmosphere, into the void beyond. There, across the vast ocean of stars, humanity lay broken and scattered. Worlds that had once shared kinship with Terra through ancient networks of trade and travel were now silent, cut off by storms of the warp. Entire systems had vanished behind walls of immaterium turbulence, their names spoken only as myths. Those few colonies that endured did so in isolation, shaped by centuries of darkness. On one planet, humans lived as little more than hunters, their ancestors' machines reduced to relics worshipped as gods. On another, iron tyrants ruled with technologies their subjects no longer understood, enslaving millions in the shadow of rusting manufactoria. This was the galaxy the Emperor saw, fractured, wounded, and teetering between survival and oblivion. To leave mankind scattered was to invite extinction, to allow alien empires and darker powers to consume humanity piece by piece. Terra was unified, but the galaxy remained a labyrinth of threats. And so, from Earth's peace, he turned his vision outward, to reclaim not a world but a species. When the warp storms first erupted across the galaxy, few understood the scale of the calamity that had begun. For millennia, humanity's colonies had flourished during the golden age of technology. Warp drives and stable routes linked thousands of worlds. Artificial intelligences and advanced sciences made prosperity seem eternal. But with the sudden, violent surge of the Immaterium, those routes collapsed. Communication ceased. Trade died. And worlds that had once looked to Terra or to each other were left utterly alone. Isolation reshaped them. Some colonies, deprived of vital supplies, fell into starvation and ruin. Their descendants clawed for survival, reduced to fractured tribes hunting through the ruins of their ancestor cities. The languages of mankind splintered, warped by centuries of isolation, until human voices on distant worlds no longer sounded familiar to one another. Other colonies clung to fragments of technology, but forgot the knowledge to sustain it. On these worlds, machines became sacred, worshipped as divine relics. The flickering glow of a reactor was not seen as the work of human hands, but as a gift of gods or spirits. Whole cultures rose around fragments of the past, building religions upon the broken bones of science. There were darker fates still. On some worlds, humans enslaved one another in endless cycles of war, or bent the knee to alien masters who found use in humanity's labor but little respect for its spirit. Elsewhere, isolated systems fell to the whispers of the warp itself. There, mankind did not merely decline. It was corrupted. Mortals bound themselves to powers they did not understand, forging pacts that would doom their lineages for generations to come. And yet, despite the galaxy's hostility, pockets of resilience endured. On a few rare worlds, leaders preserved enough knowledge to sustain a flicker of civilization. Cities survived behind fortress walls, guarded by armies wielding weapons they could no longer manufacture. Some even pushed outward, creating tiny starfaring empires of their own, doomed to stagnation, but proud of their fleeting independence. To the Emperor, the scattered state was unacceptable. Humanity was not meant to crawl through ruins or bow before alien thrones. The vision of the Great Crusade was born from necessity as much as ambition. A race so fractured could not survive. Unity was not merely a dream. It was a weapon against extinction. When the storms at last began to abate, the void opened once more. Warp travel, though perilous, became possible. And in that fragile calm, the Emperor prepared. The armies of Terra had been forged into a weapon of unyielding strength. The legions of space marines his sons made manifest waited only for the order to march. For beyond Terra lay a galaxy of humanity, waiting to be reclaimed. Though most did not know it yet, they had forgotten their kinship with Earth, forgotten that they were not alone. Some would welcome reunion with awe, kneeling in gratitude before the golden banners of unity. Others would resist with stubborn pride, seeing in Terra's return not salvation, but conquest. The galaxy of scattered mankind was a galaxy of contradictions, noble remnants, primitive ruins, enslaved outposts, corrupted strongholds. It was a galaxy waiting to be reforged, or destroyed in the attempt. The Emperor understood the cost, but he also understood the stakes. To gather humanity was to save it. To leave it divided was to consign it to the slow hunger of alien empires, the creeping corruption of the warp, and the endless erosion of ignorance. Thus the stage was set. The Great Crusade would not begin with Terra alone. It would begin with all that humanity had lost, scattered like dust across the stars. Before the Emperor's banners could fly across the galaxy, there was a question older than the Crusade itself. How does one conquer the stars without ships? Terra had been reforged in fire and blood. The techno-barbarian warlords were broken, the age of strife's tyrants cast down. The Thunder Warriors, once instruments of unification, had been sacrificed for peace. And yet, for all his triumphs, the Emperor knew his dominion ended at the edges of Earth's sky. To march upon the galaxy required fleets, and fleets demanded knowledge that Terra alone no longer possessed. That knowledge lay upon Mars. The Red Planet had survived the Age of Strife in a way no other world had. Its surface was a desolation of dust and storms, yet beneath the domes and forges of its high fortresses, the old engines of the dark age of technology still rumbled. The tech priests of Mars, twisted and half-machine in their devotion to ancient craft, had preserved secrets lost elsewhere. They could still forge plasma reactors, void shields, and starships. To them, technology was not merely a tool, but a god. They were the Mechanicum, servants of the Omnisia. For millennia, Mars had gazed upon Terra as both kin and rival. The cradle of humanity and its forged world circled the same sun, yet they were divided by more than distance. On Mars, machine worship had hardened into a faith. To question the sanctity of technology was heresy. To the Emperor, such superstition was a chain upon the human spirit. But he was no fool. He knew that unity with Mars must come not through conquest, but through covenant. When his emissaries crossed the void to Mars, they carried no weapons. They bore instead words, and a presence that shook the foundations of Mechanicum's faith. For when the tech priests beheld the Emperor, they saw not merely a man of flesh, but the living embodiment of their prophecy, the Omnisia incarnate, the god of machines made manifest. It was a revelation carefully cultivated. The Emperor did not deny the title, though he never truly embraced it. He allowed them to see what they wished to see, for in their belief lay the foundation of alliance. Mars bent the knee, not as a conquered world, but as a partner. And in that moment, the Great Crusade was given the engines it required. The Treaty of Mars was signed, its clauses etched in sacred data script. The Mechanicum would pledge their forges, their fleets, and their legions of war machines to the Emperor's cause. In return, they would be granted autonomy in matters of faith and ritual, free to worship the machine god so long as their loyalty to unity remained unbroken. With this pact, humanity's two great powers, the cradle and the forge, became one. Shipyards blazed alive, constructing vessels not seen in centuries. Titans of the Legio Titanicus, walking gods of war, strode once more beneath banners of both Mars and Terra. The fabric of conquest was woven from steel, plasma, and faith. This was the first true step of the Great Crusade. Without Mars, Terra would have reached no further than her own sky. With Mars, the stars were opened, yet beneath the triumph, shadows stirred. The Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, knew the danger of compromise. The Mechanicum's devotion to their machine god was a seed of contradiction within his vision of a purely secular imperium. Their faith, tolerated for now, would one day clash with his dream of a humanity free of superstition. But that was a conflict for another age. For now, the Omnisia and the Emperor were one in the eyes of Mars. For now, the fleets of the Mechanicum bore his legions into the void. The stars awaited, and humanity would march upon them with fire and steel. The forges of Mars burned with a brilliance not seen in millennia. From their docks slid vessels vast enough to blot out the stars. Great void ships whose keels echoed with the hymns of machine priests and whose engines thrummed like the heartbeat of titans. On Terra, the Emperor's chosen sons, the Space Marines, stood ready, gene-forged in the crucibles of science and war. They were more than men, taller, stronger, swifter, armored in ceramite, and armed with weapons that could tear through steel. They were the legions of Astartes, the instruments by which humanity would be reunited. When the first fleets rose from Terra's atmosphere, their ascension was more than a physical act. It was symbolic, the moment the Emperor's dream unfurled in earnest. Humanity's exile into the void was over. No longer would the stars be ruled by isolated tyrants and forgotten empires. A new dawn was rising, and the legions were its heralds. Each legion bore its own character, shaped by the gene seed of its absent Primarch. Though their fathers remained scattered across the galaxy, their essence lived within the warriors they had unknowingly sired. Some legions favored relentless assault, their gene heritage driving them to fury on the battlefield. Others moved with clinical precision, their tactics echoing the cold logic of their Primarchs to be. And yet, all shared one unifying truth: absolute devotion to the Emperor. The first campaign struck at the systems closest to Sol. These were wars not of glory, but necessity, sweeping away remnants of techno-barbarian kingdoms that had lingered on isolated worlds, stamping out rogue fleets that preyed upon the weak. To those who resisted, the legions brought annihilation swift and total. To those who submitted, the Emperor extended protection and integration into his vision of unity. Word spread quickly. Across the scattered remnants of human civilization, rumors whispered of golden warriors descending from the skies, of fleets that carried the fire rebirth, of an emperor whose gaze pierced the void itself. Some worlds trembled at the thought and prepared to resist. Others prayed for deliverance. Still others had long since forgotten their kinship with Terra and greeted the legions as strangers. Yet not all battles were waged with bolter and blade. The Emperor himself strode at the head of his armies, and where he went, diplomacy often achieved what war might have ruined. To those with wisdom enough to see, he offered alliance and uplift, integrating their strength into the growing Imperium. But for those who clung to the powers of the warp, to alien influence, or to false idols, there was no mercy. The galaxy would be purged of such corruption. The legions proved themselves swiftly. On the moons of Saturn, a warlord's fortress was shattered by the guns of the fleet, its walls reduced to molten slag. On the mining worlds of the Jovian system, renegade human enclaves were brought to heal, their factories repurposed for the crusade. Beyond Sol, the fleet slept system by system, reclaiming what had been lost. Each victory added momentum. Each conquest tightened the web of unity. And as the legions marched, something greater stirred. The Emperor knew that his sons, the true leaders of these armies, were still out there, scattered by the hand of chaos long ago. The Primarchs, lost but not forgotten, awaited rediscovery. And so, while the fleet secured system after system, the Emperor's gaze remained fixed upon the wider galaxy. It was a time of triumph, yet also of anticipation. The legions were mighty, but they were not yet complete. The return of the Primarchs would change everything. For now, however, they were the perfect soldiers, obedient, tireless, unstoppable. Where their boots fell, worlds were brought into the fold. Where their banners flew, the promise of unity rose unchallenged. The galaxy was vast, and the task monumental. But the first steps had been taken. Humanity was on the march once more, and the sound of ceramite boots upon alien soil echoed like thunder across the stars. The galaxy, once a graveyard of human hopes, began to stir with the tremors of something long destined. For decades, the legions had marched in the Emperor's name, conquering and unified without falter, but always with a quiet incompleteness. The Emperor knew well that the heart of his design had not yet been realized. His true generals, his sons, remained scattered. The Primarchs, cast adrift in their infancy, had been taken by the currents of the warp, scattered across the stars by the hand of malevolent powers. Yet fate, as it often does, began to shift. The first rediscoveries came not as accidents, but as inevitabilities. Each world claimed by the Imperium widened the web of possibility. Every campaign revealing hints of ancient records, fragmented transmissions, or half-forgotten myths that whisper of extraordinary figures leading isolated human societies. The Emperor, with his unmatched perception, followed these threads as a hunter follows the spoor of a great beast. The first Primarch found was Horus. His rediscovery was not merely a reunion, but a moment of cosmic resonance. Horus, raised among the harsh clans of the world of Chthoniya, had grown into a warrior and a leader of unmatched charisma. When the Emperor revealed himself to his son, Horus recognized him not as a stranger, but as a father he had long yearned for, the unspoken presence that had haunted his dreams. Their bond was immediate and profound, setting Horus apart from all his brothers. The legion that bore Horus' genetic legacy was transformed overnight. Where once they had been disciplined and effective, now they were inspired. With their father among them, the Luna Wolves became the spearhead of the Great Crusade, their campaigns swift and decisive. Other legions admired them, measured themselves against their brilliance. Horus was not simply a commander. He was a symbol of what the Imperium could become when its Primarchs were restored. Soon after came Leman Russ, found upon the savage ice world of Fenris. Where Horus embodied unity and inspiration, Russ embodied ferocity and primal loyalty. The Emperor met his son not in courtly diplomacy, but in combat. The clash between them was fierce, a storm of strength and will that shook the very mountains. Yet when it ended, Russ knelt, not out of defeat, but from recognition. He saw in the Emperor the one master worthy of his allegiance. The space wolves, already fearsome, became an unstoppable tide under their father's gaze, their savagery tempered by his iron hand. As the Great Crusade pressed further, more rediscoveries followed. Fulgrim, the Phoenician, was raised among artisans and philosophers, a man who embodied perfection in all pursuits. Upon being found, he brought not only martial brilliance, but a vision of cultural rebirth, seeking to uplift humanity as much through beauty as through conquest. His sons, the Emperor's children, bore his relentless pursuit of excellence. Every battle a symphony, every victory a masterpiece. Perturabo was discovered in harsher circumstances, a master of logic and fortifications. His life had been one of endless siege and struggle. Where others had basked in glory, he had endured hardship and betrayal, his genius honed by bitterness. When the Emperor came for him, Perturabo bent the knee, but a shadow remained in his heart. His iron warriors became siege breakers without peer, their discipline matched only by their relentless endurance. Each rediscovery was a moment of triumph, but also a revelation. The Primarchs were not blank slates. They were men shaped by worlds alien and strange, molded by circumstances beyond the Emperor's control. Their loyalty was his, but their natures were their own, and in them lay both the greatest strength of the Imperium and the seeds of future ruin. As the decades passed, the tally of rediscovered sons grew. The Imperium expanded at an exponential pace, its wars now led not merely by the legions, but by the demigods for whom those legions had been forged. Campaigns that might have dragged into centuries were concluded in years. Alien empires crumbled before the combined brilliance of the Primarchs. Humanity surged forth like a tidal wave, claiming lost worlds of forgotten systems with unstoppable momentum. Yet through it all, two shadows persisted. Of the 20 sons, only 18 stood at the Emperor's side. Two names were never spoken, their records struck from all archives, their images purged from every monument. The lost Primarchs remained mysteries, known only to the Emperor himself, and perhaps to the darkest whispers of the warp. Their absence was felt even amidst triumph, an unspoken reminder that perfection was forever beyond reach. And yet, for the galaxy at large, this was a golden age. The Primarchs, long lost, now stood reunited with their father. The legions, once incomplete, marched under their true commanders. The dream of unity seemed unstoppable. Every rediscovery fueled not only the power of the Imperium, but the belief that destiny itself had chosen mankind to rise again. It was an age of hope, of grandeur, of inevitability. But as always, within hope lies the shadow of tragedy. The sons of the Emperor, though united in purpose, were not uniform in spirit. Their differences, their flaws, their passions, all these would one day matter. For now, however, the galaxy trembled before the march of the Primarchs, and the Emperor's dream burned brighter than ever before. The galaxy burned with the light of conquest. System after system had fallen. Alien empires had been broken, and lost human worlds had returned to the fold. The Great Crusade, once tentative, now thundered across the stars with unstoppable momentum. At the heart of it all stood the Primarchs, each one a titan of war and vision, their legions surging forward under banners of victory. And yet, the Emperor knew that such a war could not be fought by his hand alone forever. The Imperium was vast beyond comprehension, its frontiers stretching across gulfs of space that no single mind or body could control. Even he, with his mastery and foresight, recognized the need for one voice to lead in his stead. Among his sons, a commander must be chosen, not only to direct armies, but to embody the Emperor's vision when his presence was elsewhere. The decision was monumental. To elevate one Primarch above the others was to create a fulcrum upon which the balance of their brotherhood would tilt. Yet the delay was to risk disunity, for already the Imperium's expansion demanded a single hand at the helm. The Emperor chose Horus. On a war-torn world newly conquered, amid the ruins of alien citadels, the Emperor gathered his sons. Warriors and fleets stood in attendance, banners snapping in alien winds, the air heavy with the weight of ceremony. Before them all, the Emperor proclaimed Horus the War Master, supreme commander of the Great Crusade, his right hand and voice across the stars. For Horus, it was a fulfillment of destiny. He had always stood closest to the Emperor, bound not only by blood, but by a deep and instinctive understanding. Where others sought recognition, Horus carried a loyalty that burned like fire, his devotion unquestioned. The title was not a gift, but recognition of what already was. And yet, its implications were vast. The legions roared their approval, the Luna wolves above all. To them, their father's triumph was their own, proof that they stood at the forefront of history. Some Primarchs greeted the decision with open pride, others with measured acceptance, still others with silence. Among them flickered envy, pride, and the first subtle sparks of resentment. For though Horus was the War Master, each of them had known themselves to be extraordinary. Each carried a fragment of their father's power, to be set beneath a brother. This was a burden not all could carry lightly. Yet the moment was triumphant, overwhelming. Across the Imperium, the news spread like wildfire. The Emperor had named his War Master, the warlord who would carry mankind to its ultimate destiny. Worlds celebrated. Fleets redoubled their efforts. Soldiers marched with renewed faith. Under Horus' command, the crusade surged forward with even greater momentum, his charisma binding Primarchs and mortals alike into a unified spear. It was a decision born of necessity, rooted in trust, carried on the wings of love between father and son. But even the wisest could not predict how deep the consequences would run. To elevate one above brothers was to test bonds already stretched by distance, rivalry, and difference. The seeds were planted, unseen but waiting. For in the galaxy, as in the warp, nothing remained still forever. For now, however, there was only triumph. The banners of the Imperium flew high. The War Master had risen, and the galaxy itself seemed ready to kneel before the Emperor's dream. The naming of Horus as War Master marked both an ending and a beginning. The crusade, once driven by the Emperor's immediate presence, now found itself guided by his chosen son. In this lay the strength of the Imperium, a command structure forged in loyalty and love, capable of sustaining expansion across a galaxy without limit. For the legions, the future had never seemed so certain. Victories mounted, campaigns accelerated, and the dream of unity grew ever more tangible with each passing year. Yet beneath the triumph, subtle currents stirred. Some Primarchs bore the Emperor's choice with grace, acknowledging the wisdom of his decision. Others carried their acceptance like armor, concealing doubts that festered beneath. They were beings of immense pride, demigods raised above mortals. And to see a brother set above them was a wound too deep for some to ignore. For now, those feelings remained buried, hidden beneath those of loyalty and the shared glory of conquest. But time has a way of drawing out what is hidden, and envy, once seated, rarely lies dormant forever. The Emperor, in his infinite foresight, surely knew the risks of his choice. Yet he also knew the necessity. Without a War Master, the crusade would falter. With Horus at its helm, it soared. The galaxy lay open before them, waiting to be claimed. And so, with banners high and the Emperor's vision blazing like a star, the Great Crusade pressed onward, into triumph, into destiny, and into shadows yet unseen. Victory echoed across the stars. The Great Crusade, now under the guiding hand of Horus, seemed unstoppable. Alien empires that had once ruled with cold dominion crumbled before the united force of the legions. Lost human colonies were reclaimed, their weary descendants kneeling in awe before the golden banners of the Emperor. The galaxy, vast and merciless, bent slowly but surely to the will of Terra. And yet, triumph does not silence all voices. Beneath the grandeur of conquest lay the quiet murmurs of discontent. The Primarchs, though bound to their father and to the dream of unity, were not alike. Each bore within himself not only the gifts of his gene forging, but the indelible marks of the worlds that had shaped him. Their temperaments clashed, their visions of the Imperium diverged, and pride, so natural to beings of such magnitude, kindled rivalries. Some questioned the Emperor's decision to name Horus War Master, wondering if their own worth had been overlooked. Others saw in their brothers rise a challenge to prove themselves greater still. And while the legions marched ever onward, the differences in their methods grew sharper. For some, war was an art. For others, a sacred duty. For still others, it was a brutal necessity to be prosecuted without hesitation. Thus, even in the glow of unity, seeds of discord took root. The Emperor's dream was vast, but within the hearts of his sons, small shadows began to grow. Shadows that would one day darken the stars themselves. The Primarchs were brothers, bound by blood, by design, and by the will of the Emperor. Yet they were not equals, not in temperament, nor in method, nor in the scars left by the worlds that had raised them. Each carried the essence of divinity within his veins, but each expressed it in ways as different as the stars themselves. And in those differences, the first rivalries took shape. It began subtly, in whispers exchanged among warriors, in the quiet judgments made after campaigns. Fulgrim, whose pursuit of perfection bordered on obsession, scoffed at the crude savagery of Leman Russ and his space wolves. Where Fulgrim saw art and elegance in war, Russ saw only the simple truth of battle won or lost. Their clashes of philosophy became clashes of pride, manifesting in contests staged on campaign after campaign. When Fulgrim's warriors carved precise and flawless victories, they mocked the wolves' brutality. When the wolves crushed their enemies with relentless fury, they mocked the Emperor's children for their vanity. Elsewhere, Perturabo simmered with quiet resentment. His iron warriors fought wars that others avoided, wars of attrition, sieges that dragged on for months or years, grinding struggles that yielded little glory. While Horus basked in the light of triumph, while Fulgrim was praised for his brilliance, Perturabo endured the grinding weight of uncelebrated duty. He built fortresses, broke walls, and turned hopeless battles into victories, but the songs of the Imperium rarely carried his name. To a heart already wounded by bitterness, this silence was a poison. Magnus the Red, whose brilliance and sorcery and knowledge surpassed all others, drew both admiration and suspicion. His 1,000 sons bent the warp to their will, mastering powers that other legions dared not touch. To some, this was wondrous, proof of mankind's true destiny. To others, it was dangerous, a dalliance with forces that could never be tamed. Russ distrusted him openly, and even Dorn, the steadfast son of fortresses, regarded Magnus with unease. The seeds of suspicion grew, fueled by differences too vast to reconcile. Even among those closest to Horus, rivalry took root. Angron, brutal and uncompromising, chafed under any command, even that of the war master he respected. His world eaters fought with savagery that horrified others, their battlefield discipline often dissolving into orgies of blood. Horus admired Angron's fury, but feared its consequences, for Angron was not a commander who could be guided. He was a storm, unleashed upon the galaxy. The legions, shaped by their fathers, mirrored these rivalries. On campaign, their methods clashed. The Raven Guard's precision strikes seemed wasteful to the attritional Iron Warriors. The Ultramarines' meticulous order appeared stifling to the wolves. The White Scar's lightning raids, conducted with speed and unpredictability, were derided as reckless by Dorn's imperial fists. Each victory won was another chance to compare, to boast, to resent. The Emperor, though aware of these rivalries, allowed them to exist. Perhaps he believed that competition forged strength, that his sons would temper one another as steel is tempered by fire. Perhaps he foresaw that greater trials would one day demand unity stronger than pride. Yet for all his foresight, the reality was simple. The Primarchs were not only brothers but rivals, each convinced in his own way that he alone best embodied the destiny of mankind. The legions, though loyal, were not immune to these divisions. Astartes are shaped not only by their gene seed but by their culture, and the culture of their fathers was etched deeply into their souls. They followed their Primarchs with absolute devotion, and in doing so, mirrored their rivalries, carrying disputes from halls of strategy into the fires of battle. These were not yet open schisms. The Primarchs still fought as brothers, their banners flying beneath the same sun. Yet the cracks had formed, faint but undeniable. Pride clashed with pride, vision with vision, and as the crusade surged ever forward, those cracks widened with each conquest, each glory won, each slight, real or imagined, left unhealed. For now, the galaxy saw only triumph, but within the brotherhood of demigods, storm clouds gathered, unseen by those who looked only at the banners of victory. The title of War Master was more than an honor. It was a crown of iron and fire. When the Emperor withdrew from the Great Crusade to labor upon his secret works upon Terra, he entrusted its momentum, its vision, and its authority to Horus Lupercal, his most beloved son. In that moment, Horus ceased to be only a Primarch. He became the supreme commander of the greatest martial endeavor in human history. The destinies of trillions bent toward him, and the loyalty of legions, his brother's legions, was meant to follow. At first, Horus bore the title with pride. He was a favored son, the one chosen above all others. In his heart, he believed the Emperor's trust was both earned and deserved. He had always been a commander of charisma and cunning, a leader whose presence inspired absolute devotion. To his Luna wolves, his ascension was proof that their father was supreme among Primarchs. To many others, it was natural. Who else, if not Horus, whose victory spanned across stars, whose judgment rarely faltered, whose warmth bound men to him like gravity itself? But authority brings isolation. No longer was Horus only a brother among equals. Now, every decision he made was weighed against the pride and ambition of his siblings. Leman Russ respected Horus' strength, but bristled when his hunts were curtailed by orders. Fulgrim, ever perfectionist, measured Horus' strategies against his own ideals of elegance and precision. Perturabo gritted his teeth, watching once again as his sacrifices went unsung, while Horus stood in the light of glory. Even Robot Gilliman, pragmatic and loyal, questioned choices that seemed to prioritize speed over consolidation. Horus found himself in a crucible of judgment. Every council with his brothers was both a meeting of minds and a trial of wills. His words had to balance authority with persuasion, lest pride ignite into rebellion. He learned quickly that commanding legions was not the same as commanding warriors. It was herding storms, each tempest carried by a will as indomitable as his own. The Emperor had ruled with an authority that brooked no question. His word was law, his vision absolute. But Horus was not the Emperor. Though beloved, though respected, he lacked the divine aura that silenced dissent. His brothers could not help but see him as one of them, first among equals perhaps, but still a peer. And in their hearts, each believed his own way to be truer, his own vision purer. In the early years of his command, Horus strove to embody unity. He traveled from legion to legion, standing at their side in battle, breaking bread with their warriors, listening to their Primarchs as brothers rather than subjects. He laughed with Russ, debated philosophy with Magnus, endured the barbed pride of Fulgrim. In every gesture, he sought to prove that his authority was not tyranny, but trust. He wanted his brothers to see him not as master, but as a thread binding them together. Yet even as he worked to unify, the weight pressed heavier. Reports streamed into his command chambers by the thousands. Worlds compliant, worlds resisting, wars dragging on, disputes between legions, whispers of unrest among the mortal armies that followed in the crusade wake. The sheer scale of it was staggering. Where once Horus had lived upon the battlefield, now he lived in the war room, his mind stretched in across the stars. His Luna wolves noticed a change. Their war master, once so present, so vibrant, seemed more distant. His laughter came less often. The burdens he carried were not ones they could share, for who but Horus could bear the expectations of the Emperor himself? Even among his sons, the war master walked alone. Worse still, Horus began to feel the subtle currents of rivalry sharpening against him. Some brothers concealed their resentment. Others wore it openly. Perturabo's bitterness deepened. Onran grew ever more contemptuous of restraint. Russ grew restless under chains he did not believe should exist. These were not yet open fractures, but Horus felt them as one feels a hairline cracks in a blade. Harmless at first, but fatal when struck at the wrong angle. At night, in the stillness between campaigns, doubt whispered. Was he truly the right choice? Did the Emperor elevate him out of trust, or simply convenience? His father had departed without explanation, leaving Horus to shoulder the galaxy, while he toiled in silence. Why had the Emperor not shared his secrets with him? Why had he not confided in the son he trusted most? These questions gnawed at him, even as he drove them away with victories. For Horus still conquered. Under his command, the crusade reached heights of brilliance. Campaigns were coordinated with a precision that only Horus could weave. The legions moved like a symphony, each strike planned with genius, each war zone brought to heel in record time. His triumph silenced doubt for a time, but triumph breeds expectation. Every victory made the next one demanded. Every conquest a standard that could not falter. Horus knew that to fail, even once, would give his rivals fuel. And so he pushed harder, driving himself beyond exhaustion, masking his doubts behind the face of the War Master, the chosen son, the unbreakable commander. It was in this crucible of pressure, pride, and isolation that Horus became vulnerable. For while he still stood tall in the light of glory, his heart bore wounds unseen. He longed for the presence of his father, for the certainty that only the Emperor could provide. He longed for the unbroken brotherhood of his youth. Before rivalries had hardened into suspicion, he longed to believe that the burden he bore was truly his destiny, not a weight laid upon him out of necessity. The galaxy saw the War Master, resplendent, victorious, the paragon of leadership. But behind the armored titles and triumphs, Horus was still a son, yearning for certainty, for trust, for answers withheld. And in that yearning, a shadow stirred, a weakness that would one day be exploited, with consequences that would shake the stars themselves. The stars of the Imperium burned brightly in that age. Each new conquest of flame added to the Emperor's dominion, yet behind the blaze of glory, storm clouds gathered unseen. The Great Crusade was a work of marvel, but it was also a tapestry stretched thin, its threads strained by pride, ambition, and silence. And at its center stood Horus, the War Master, striving to hold it together with hands that could wield a blade but not always bind hearts. Whispers of discontent spread among the legions, carried not in open defiance, but in the quiet murmur of resentment. Some Primarchs believed Horus had been raised too high. Others questioned the Emperor's absence, wondering why the father of mankind had retreated to Terra, hidden away in his secret work, while his sons bled across the stars. What was so important that it required silence, secrecy, and abandonment? Those doubts festered, subtle at first, but corrosive with time. For the warriors of the legions, the burdens of endless war grew heavier. Worlds were pacified, then abandoned. Their peoples left imperial governors who often proved corrupt or inept. Soldiers marched on, leaving behind resentment and rebellion in their wake. The dream of unity was paid for in blood, but its fruits often seemed distant, even hollow. Among mortal armies, faith in the Emperor was unshakable. Among his sons, however, faith began to fray. Horus himself felt the tension most keenly. He had tried to be the bridge, the brother who listened, the leader who carried his father's light. But the Emperor's silence left a wound. Without guidance, Horus was forced to interpret vision he had not been given, to lead a war without knowing its ultimate shape. In council, he found himself justifying decisions not only to his brothers, but to himself. Each victory was balm, each doubt a thorn. And in the quiet moments between wars, when the stars drifted outside the void-shielded glass of his flagship, Horus wondered if he had been betrayed, not by his brothers nor by his sons, but by his father. For why else had the Emperor withheld the truth from him? Why else had he chosen secrecy over trust? Was Horus War Master by right, or simply a tool to be used and discarded when the Emperor's great work was done? These doubts did not yet consume him, but they lingered like embers beneath ash. All it would take was the right breath of wind to fan them into flame. Somewhere beyond the veil of material, the ruinous powers stirred, sensing weakness, sensing hunger, sensing the perfect vessel through which to strike. For the War Master was both the strongest of the Primarchs and, in his heart, the most vulnerable. Thus, the Great Crusade pressed on. Worlds fell, fleets triumphed, the Imperium stretched wider with every passing year. To mortal eyes, it was an age of glory unparalleled. To the Primarchs, it was an age of questions, of rivalries sharpened and wounds unhealed. To Horus, it was a lonely crown, heavy with expectation, shadowed by silence. And far beyond, in the currents of the warp, something laughed, softly, patiently, hungrily. The storm was not yet upon them, but its winds had begun to rise.